Her baby was crying in the freezing night, her little fists trembling against the cold air, while her mother held her tight on a soaked sidewalk. No one stopped, no one even looked twice, until a black car slowed and a billionaire known only for his silence stepped out. What happened next would change both their lives forever, and it would shake an empire to its core. If you believe that one small moment can transform despair into hope, then stay with me. Subscribe now so you don't miss these powerful stories, drop a like to help more people see this one, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you saw a mother and baby shivering alone on that night? The night was bitter, the kind of cold that made even the streetlights flicker as if they too wanted to retreat indoors. Maria Ramirez held her baby close, her thin shawl soaked by drizzle that turned to needles against her skin. Sofia whimpered softly, her cheeks burning red from the cold, her breaths shallow and uneven. Maria whispered a lullaby, voice trembling, not because she believed it would soothe her child, but because silence felt heavier than any song. She kept walking, coins clinking in her pocket, counting them over and over as though repetition could magically turn pennies into dollars. Milk was out of reach, medicine was out of reach, and warmth was a dream that mocked her in the open air. At that same moment, a car rolled slowly down the slick street, its tinted windows hiding a man who had never once stopped to consider what it felt like to have nothing. Alexander Gray, a billionaire by fortune and a ghost by reputation, sat rigid in the back seat. He had just left a gala where champagne and laughter filled rooms that meant nothing to him. He had written another check, shaken another hand, played his part in a performance he no longer believed in. His silence was legend. He was the man who never spoke at conferences, the man whose grief had sealed his lips since the death of his wife. To the world he was power and mystery combined. But tonight, through the window of that car, he was something else entirely. A witness. Maria's frail figure, clutching her child against the merciless cold, carved through his chest like a blade. For the first time in years, something in him cracked. He raised his hand, his voice low but unshakable, "Stop the car." The driver hesitated only a moment before obeying. The car door opened and Alexander stepped into the night. His coat was long, heavy, the kind of garment tailored for men who never worried about frost. Without a word, he removed it and placed it over the baby. Maria froze, instinctively stepping back. Men in suits didn't mean kindness. She had learned that long ago. But the weight of the coat, the sudden warmth wrapping around Sofia, forced her pride into silence. Her eyes traveled upward, catching his face in the dim light. Recognition struck. This wasn't just a stranger. This was Alexander Gray. Her breath caught. She had seen his photo in magazines left behind at the diner. She had heard whispers at the counter, stories about his billions, about his silence, about the empire he commanded without uttering a word. And now he was standing in front of her, close enough to touch, close enough for her daughter's tiny fingers to curl into the fabric of his coat. "Does she need milk?" His voice was soft but carried the weight of steel. Maria's throat tightened. Pride urged her to say no. Reality, in the form of Sofia's whimper, forced the truth from her lips. "Yes." Alexander nodded once. "Come with me." The words were simple, but to Maria they felt like stepping through a doorway into a world she had no map for. The ride to the city center was surreal. Maria sat stiffly in the back seat, the child wrapped in the billionaire's coat, the smell of wool and faint cologne filling her nose. She said nothing, certain that speaking might break the spell. Alexander said nothing either, but his silence was different. It wasn't the absence of care, it was the weight of thought. He left her at the corner of her neighborhood with a bag that contained formula and medicine. She tried to return the coat, pressing it against his chest. He shook his head. "Keep it." And then he was gone, swallowed back into the world of wealth and power. Maria stared after the car until its taillights disappeared, her baby breathing easier against her chest. She told herself it was over, a moment of grace she would not see again. But fate, as always, had other plans. The next morning, Maria folded the coat neatly, determined to return it. She couldn't bear the thought of owing something to a man like him. With Sofia strapped against her chest, she stepped into the lobby of Gray Enterprises. The building towered above her, all glass and steel, shining with the arrogance of money. She felt like an intruder the moment she crossed the threshold. Security guards moved toward her, their eyes narrowing, but then silence fell across the marble floor. Alexander Gray himself appeared, tall and unmovable, and with a simple gesture of his hand, he beckoned her to follow. The staff watched in stunned silence as a poor woman with a baby disappeared into the CEO's private elevator. In his office, vast and cold, Maria set the folded coat on his desk. "I didn't come for favors," she said quickly, voice trembling. "I only came to return what's yours." Alexander studied her for a long moment. His eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to strip away pretense. Finally he spoke. "Keep it." Maria opened her mouth to argue, but her gaze fell on a ledger lying open on his desk. Unlike the glossy reports of wealth she imagined filled such an office, this one was different. Its pages were worn, filled with notes scribbled in his own hand. Words leapt out: energy grids, neighborhoods, access, solstice. She blinked, realizing this wasn't about profit margins. It was about something larger, something meant for people like her. Alexander closed the ledger quietly, his expression unreadable. Maria felt her face burn, embarrassed for noticing. She gathered her daughter and left quickly, certain she would never be summoned there again. But Alexander Gray was not a man who acted on impulse without consequence. Something about Maria lingered in his thoughts. Her refusal to beg, her fierce dignity even in poverty, the way her eyes caught his secrets without meaning to. She had stirred something he had buried under years of silence. He wasn't the only one who noticed. By afternoon, the tabloids were ablaze. A grainy photograph showed Maria stepping into his car, Sophia wrapped in his coat. Headlines screamed across the city: Gray's mystery woman. Investors panicked, whispers turned into accusations, and the empire he had built on silence suddenly roared with scandal. Maria's world collapsed overnight. Reporters crowded her building, shouting questions she couldn't answer, twisting her story into a narrative she didn't recognize. Neighbors whispered, some with envy, others with malice. At the diner, her manager pulled her aside, his expression sour. "People are talking. Customers don't like scandal with their coffee." He handed her an unpaid leave slip, pretending it was mercy. Maria wanted to scream that she had done nothing wrong. But the truth was no one cared. In their eyes, she had become part of a story that wasn't hers to control. And across town, Alexander's rivals sharpened their knives. Victor Kane, the man who had waited years for a chance to take him down, seized the moment. "He's compromised," Victor told the board with a smile. "Distracted. His silence used to be power. Now it looks like guilt. The market won't forgive weakness." In the cold glare of chandeliers, decisions were being made, about her life, about his future, about an empire built on silence that now trembled under the weight of a single act of kindness. Reporters crowded the cracked pavement outside Maria's building by sunrise. Microphones shoved in her face, cameras flashing, voices throwing questions she could not answer. "Who are you to Alexander Gray? Are you his mistress? Is the baby his? How long have you been together?" She clutched Sophia tighter, shielding her from the chaos, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She hadn't done anything but accept milk and a coat, yet the world had decided she was someone to be torn apart. Her neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, peeked out from her door with narrowed eyes. "Trouble follows you," she muttered, slamming the door shut before Maria could even respond. Shame burned her skin. The few people who had once nodded kindly at her in the hallway now looked at her with suspicion, envy, or disgust. The city was cruel enough when you were invisible. It was far worse when the spotlight turned on you uninvited. Meanwhile, across town in the glass tower of Gray Enterprises, Alexander walked into the boardroom. The table stretched long and polished, lined with men and women who owed their wealth to his silence. Today, however, silence was not welcome. They wanted explanations. Victor Kane sat at the far end, his smile sharp as a blade. "Alexander," one board member began cautiously, "the markets are unsettled. Investors are nervous. This photograph, it raises questions." Alexander said nothing at first. He set his hand on the table, fingers still. His silence was not empty, it was heavy. Everyone felt it pressing into their chest. When he finally spoke, it was deliberate, low, and clear. "What questions?" Victor leaned forward, enjoying the moment. "Questions about judgment, about weakness, about whether your personal entanglements are clouding your ability to lead." A ripple of murmurs spread. The implication was poison. Alexander's eyes flicked toward Victor, and for a heartbeat, the two men held a silent war across the table. Finally, Alexander stood, his voice a single sentence. "I make decisions based on strategy, not scandal." But the truth lingered in the room. The board smelled blood. Back in her apartment, Maria sat on the floor, back pressed against the wall, trying to rock Sophia to sleep. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but escape seemed impossible. Every time she stepped outside, cameras followed. Every time she tried to speak, her words twisted. When she finally answered one reporter's question with trembling honesty, "He only helped me once. That's all." The headline the next day screamed, "Gray's secret affair exposed by struggling mother." Her phone buzzed with messages she hadn't asked for. Some were cruel, gold digger, fraud, trash. Others were desperate, "Please tell us the truth. Is he really human? Did he speak to you?" The weight of strangers' curiosity felt heavier than hunger ever had. She thought about leaving the city, but where would she go? She had no money, no allies, no safety net. And worst of all, her baby was caught in the storm. Sophia deserved warmth, not headlines. One night, as rain pounded against the window, there was a knock on her door. She froze. Reporters didn't knock politely. Slowly, she opened it to reveal a man in a gray suit. Not Alexander. One of his aides. "Mr. Gray requests that you come with us," he said softly, as though offering protection. Maria hesitated, but the desperation in her chest won. Within an hour, she found herself back inside the tower, led into a private office smaller than the grand boardroom but no less intimidating. And there he was, Alexander Gray, standing by the window, the city lights stretching beneath him like a galaxy. For the first time, Maria spoke before he did. "Why me?" Her voice was raw, stripped of any pretense. "Why did you stop that night? You could have driven away like everyone else." Alexander turned slowly, his face shadowed by the city's glow. His words were quiet, almost reluctant. "Because I couldn't." It wasn't an explanation, not fully, but something in the way he said it made her chest ache. She saw no pity in his eyes, only recognition, like he had seen himself in her desperation. She didn't know that Alexander's silence hid more than grief. The ledger on his desk, the one she had glimpsed before, wasn't just numbers. It was the plan for Solstice, a project meant to bring affordable energy to neighborhoods abandoned by profit. A project the board wanted buried because it threatened their control. Maria had noticed it by accident, but to Alexander that accident had meant something. She had seen possibility where others only saw risk. Their fragile conversation was interrupted by a knock. The aide entered again, his face tight. "Sir, the press has learned she's here." Maria's stomach dropped. Alexander's jaw tightened. He moved closer, his presence both intimidating and strangely protective. "Do you trust me?" he asked. Maria wanted to laugh bitterly. Trust? How could she trust a man whose world was built on secrets and walls of glass? But when Sophia stirred in her arms, Maria's answer came from a place deeper than reason. She nodded. Alexander acted swiftly. He led her not through the lobby, but through hidden corridors, down to an underground garage. As the car doors shut and the noise of cameras faded behind them, Maria felt a strange calm settle. For the first time in days she could breathe. The car pulled into a gated estate on the edge of the city. The mansion loomed, its windows glowing against the night. Maria stepped out, clutching Sophia, her heart thundering. Everything about this place screamed wealth beyond imagining. The marble steps, the towering doors, the silence that seemed to hum with power. She hesitated on the threshold, afraid to soil the floors with her worn shoes. Alexander noticed. He didn't urge her forward. He simply walked ahead, leaving the choice to her. After a moment, Maria stepped inside. The air smelled of polish and cedar. Chandeliers glittered above, but the house felt empty. Not in space, but in spirit. Maria understood then why people called him the man of silence. The walls themselves seemed to echo with it. He led her to a guest room, modest by his standards but larger than her entire apartment. A bed layered with blankets stood waiting. Maria froze at the doorway, overwhelmed. She had slept on floors, on couches, on cardboard. This was another universe. Slowly, she placed Sophia on the bed, the baby's tiny body sinking into softness. Tears burned her eyes before she could stop them. Alexander lingered at the door. His voice was steady but softer than before. "Rest. You're safe here." Maria wanted to believe him. She wanted to let the weight slide from her shoulders. But part of her new safety was never permanent. Not for people like her. That night, as Sophia slept for the first time without shivering, Maria sat awake by the window. She could feel the house breathing around her, silent, watchful. Somewhere down the hall, Alexander stood in his study, staring at the ledger marked Solstice, knowing that his enemies were moving faster now. And both of them understood, this was only the beginning. Morning found the house quiet in a way that wasn't empty anymore. Maria woke to the soft weight of a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and soap, and for a second she didn't know where she was. Then Sophia's warm breath pressed against her collarbone and the memory returned. The car, the gates, the room that felt like a dream someone had forgotten to end. She sat up slowly. Light spilled through tall curtains like poured milk. On the nightstand, a glass of water waited beside a folded note in neat, exact handwriting. Breakfast is down the hall when you want it. Take your time. No name, but it didn't need one. She washed her face in a bathroom that could have been its own apartment, then carried Sophia down a corridor where the floor hushed their steps. A woman with sleeves rolled above strong forearms and a face that said she'd seen every kind of arrival met her with a nod and a smile that didn't pry. "I'm Mara," she said. "I keep the kitchen honest. So, eat while it's hot." The table was laid without showing off: eggs, toast, sliced fruit, oatmeal steaming gently. Maria felt the old impulse to refuse, to say she would only take a little, to prove she wasn't here to consume. Mara set a bowl in front of her anyway, then scooped a smaller one for Sophia with the efficiency of someone who knows hunger has no time for ceremony. "You're safe here," Mara said, as if reading thoughts off the surface of the oatmeal. "Not because of the walls. Because the people inside them want you to be." "People?" Maria asked before she could stop herself. Mara's mouth quirked. "Some people. Enough." After breakfast, Maria drifted through the edges of the house, never quite entering the center of any room. She didn't touch the piano, but she looked at its keys the way you look at a river you've never learned to swim. On a side table, in a silver frame, a photograph caught her. Alexander with a woman whose laughter had survived the stillness of the camera. The woman's head tipped toward him as if that had always been its destination. Behind them, a small garden with uneven stones and a bench that had been chosen for comfort instead of price. There was handwriting on the mat, tiny, elegant, something about a morning and a promise. Maria looked away quickly, as if she'd opened a drawer that didn't belong to her. She found Alexander in his study not long after, standing in a square of light. He had removed his jacket, rolled his sleeves. The careful, severe lines of presentation were softened by the plain detail of an uncovered forearm. The ledger was open on the desk. Of course it was, and a schematic spread beside it showed boxes and arrows, the patient grammar of systems. He glanced up when she stepped in, then down, not dismissing her, simply finishing the thought his eyes had been holding. When he looked again, he gestured to a chair. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "More than I should have," she said. "Less than I wanted to." A corner of his mouth moved. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "Good mornings are suspicious when you're used to bad ones." She nodded, and her gaze fell to the spread of paper. "Solstice," she said before she could decide not to. He didn't flinch. "Solstice. What is it?" She kept her voice careful, as if the word might be fragile. "A change in how power is bought," he said. "And where it goes first. Not to the tallest buildings. Not to the loudest checks," he said. Then, because he had begun and honesty prefers full measures, he added, "I built a grid that feeds appetite. Solstice would feed need. And the board hates it," she said, not as a question. "They will kill it if they can," he answered. "Not because it doesn't work. Because they understand what it would say about the way things have been working." She stepped closer, drawn despite the voice in her head that reminded her of distances. The schematic clarified as she leaned in. Neighborhoods circled instead of ignored, lines rerouted through places where bills became decisions about dinner or heat. She thought of her apartment with the windows stuffed with newspaper, of the trick she had learned with the stove and the pot of water to make a room 1 degree less cruel. She thought of other mothers, other nights. "Will it happen?" she asked. "That depends on whether I can keep the power required to give it away," he said. Something in her chest tightened and then widened, an ache that wasn't pain. She realized with a small shock that she wanted him to win. Not because he had saved her, not because this house was warm, but because the lines on the paper would be a kind of apology written to streets that had never received one. Before she could answer, a phone vibrated, sharp against wood. Alexander checked it. The muscle in his jaw changed shape. "They've moved the committee vote forward," he said. "How far?" "Tomorrow." "Can you stop them?" He closed the ledger gently, as if not to wake whatever slept inside. "I can try. But they prefer a man with a mouth to a man with a map." She wanted to say something useful and found that usefulness is hard to locate in rooms like this. "Then speak," she said. "Maps don't shout, but men can." He looked away, out the window where the city posed as a view. "I stopped speaking the day words failed to keep what I loved alive," he said quietly. "Silence is a habit like any other. It can dress as dignity. It can also be fear in a better suit." She thought of the photograph, of the handwriting on the mat, of a promise and a morning. Maybe the promise wasn't to silence, she said. Maybe it was to be the kind of man who keeps promises. She picked up the thread of bravery and was surprised to find it held. Solstice sounds like a promise. His eyes met hers then, and the weight of the look felt like standing at the edge of something that could be a cliff or a beginning. He nodded once. Stay, he said, and the word carried more meanings than the sentence could hold. At least until the noise outside finds a new meal. Noise doesn't starve, she said softly. But I'll stay. The noise did not starve. By noon, another article had bloomed and rotted across the city. The photograph this time showed Maria leaving the service entrance, Sophia's bag on her shoulder, a corner of paper visible inside. The caption didn't need to say anything worse than the moment she leaves with payment. The implication did the rest. There were interviews with men who loved phrases like anonymous source and close to the situation. A clip from the press conference played on loop, stripped of the sentences that gave it context, punctured by laughter from people who had never been cold. Elena arrived with the storm scored on her face. She hugged Maria, then kissed Sophia's hair, then turned on Alexander with a degree of sister that could not be purchased. You have two choices, she said. Let them tell your story or tell it yourself. If you choose the first, I will love you. If you choose the second, I will also cook. Always bribery, he murmured. Always soup, she corrected. Then to Maria, we'll need your voice too if you can bear it. People have a habit of calling women liars when women tell the truth. We'll tell it anyway. Maria nodded. She did not want to be brave. She wanted to be allowed to live quietly. But quiet had a cost, and she was learning she couldn't afford it anymore. Tell me how, she said. Not to cameras, not yet, Elena said. To people who don't know they're ready to listen. They filmed on a phone in a room with soft light and no polish. Elena asked Maria questions the way surgeons handle instruments, cleanly, confidently, with care. How cold was the night? What did he say? What did you feel when strangers assigned you a story? Maria answered simply. She did not cry, not because she was strong, but because tears would have been a kind of currency the world was too eager to spend on her behalf. She spoke about the coat, about the milk, about the way it felt to be seen without being looked at. When they finished, Elena sent the video to exactly 6 people. Women who ran shelters, a teacher with too many students and not enough heat in winter, a nurse who kept a cupboard of socks at the clinic because she understood dignity begins at the ankles. Within hours, the video traveled in the small rivers that feed the sea. It reached nobody important and everyone who matters. In the late afternoon, a journalist who had been a nuisance to power long before it became fashionable asked for 5 minutes with Alexander. They met in the garden behind the house, where winter had left rooms for green to return. The journalist didn't waste time. Why didn't you do this earlier? He asked. Not the coat. The speaking. I thought silence protected what I loved, Alexander said. I was wrong. Do you love her? The journalist asked, not cruelly, clinically. Which her? Alexander said, and the question surprised them both. The woman, the child, the city, the dead, the journalist said, ticking them off like symptoms. Yes, Alexander said, and for once the truth didn't require paragraphs. The journalist looked at the ledger on the table between them as if it were a patient chart. Solstice is going to make you enemies you haven't met yet. I have enough chairs, Alexander said. They can sit. The committee meets tomorrow. I know. You'll lose if you go in with poetry. I'm going in with math, he said. But I may speak the math out loud. The journalist smiled a little, like a man who has watched a good storm build. I'll be there, he said. Not because I like you. Because I like endings that belong to people who started the story. Evening drew itself across the house. In the kitchen, Mara cooked like a prayer, quiet, repetitive, faithful. She set a bowl in front of Maria and another in front of Elena, then a plate where Alexander would sit if he remembered that bodies require maintenance. He did this time. They ate together like a family that hasn't been named. When Sophia fussed, Alexander reached out without performing and took the bottle as if he had done this before, because he had, long ago, in a life that had been torn and folded into the pocket of memory. The sight of the billionaire feeding the baby didn't make Maria swoon or tremble. It made her want to sleep. It made the entire world look briefly possible. After dinner, Elena walked Maria through what tomorrow might look like, how to get in the side entrance, where to sit if they let her in, what to do if they didn't. You can leave at any moment, she said. Consent is not a staircase you are required to reach the top of. What if they ask me to speak? Maria asked. Say what you would tell Sophia when she's old enough to ask why the world is sometimes cruel, Elena said. Short sentences. Real words. Night grew heavier and kind. Maria lay down beside her daughter and fell into a sleep that didn't have to fight. In another wing, Alexander stood before the photograph again. He touched the glass over his wife's smile, then lowered his hand. "Help me," he said softly to the only ghost he allowed near him. "Not to win. To be worthy of winning." At dawn, the city hardened its face. The building that held the board's room looked like it had been designed to tell people to take their feelings elsewhere. Security multiplied like mirrors. Cameras clustered. Words like transition and fiduciary duty and contingency plan were warmed up in mouths that loved their taste. Victor arrived in a suit that belonged to a man who expected cameras to be kind. He shook hands as if making promises to strangers were a sport. Maria entered through the side as instructed, carrying Sophia in a sling and the quiet in her chest like a shield. Elena walked beside her, not in front. Alexander met them at a service elevator. He looked at the baby first. "Good morning," he said to the tiny human who did not yet care about committees. Then to Maria, "You don't have to do this." "I know," she said. "But I do." He inclined his head, accepting the paradox. In the elevator, the mirror made them a strange flock. A woman in borrowed courage, a man who had finally loosened the knot in his throat, a sister who believed logistics could be a form of love, a child asleep in a world that insisted on noise. The boardroom felt colder than the hallway, though the thermostat insisted otherwise. Seats filled with people who had learned to keep their faces as still as cards in another man's hand. Harrington Price cleared his throat in a way that meant the show would begin. "We are here to consider leadership stability," he said, and the euphemism curled at the edges like old paper. Victor spoke first because men like him believe air is improved by their voices. He expressed regret, concern, caution, and then a list of reasons why Alexander's continued leadership posed a risk to shareholder value. He did not use the words poverty, mother, child, or coat. He used the words pattern, judgment, and narrative drift. He called the press conference ill-advised and performative. He suggested an interim CEO and a recalibration period. When it was Alexander's turn, he didn't stand immediately. He looked across the table and saw not villains but appetites dressed as prudence. Then he rose. He did not bring the ledger to the podium. He left it open on the table behind him, where anyone could have touched it if they cared to learn the language it spoke. "I do not apologize," he said. "Not for stopping when I saw a child in need. Not for feeding the hungry. Not for considering a grid that treats power as a necessity rather than a luxury." He paused. "If you want a leader who will never trouble you with the idea that companies exist inside communities instead of above them, then you should vote me out. If you want a leader who believes profit without purpose is a sort of theft, keep me and we'll build Solstice until you forget you ever argued against it." A murmur, the sound of people realizing they are being asked to choose between comfort and conviction. Victor opened his mouth to retort, but something shifted before he could. It was small and decisive. The door at the back opening to admit a woman carrying a baby and a fear she had decided not to feed. Maria did not ask permission to step forward. She didn't need the podium. She spoke from the doorway, her voice carrying because truth has an old habit of traveling farther than volume. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't need to. I'm nobody you would invite into this room for any reason other than today. But you should know this, when no one else stopped, he did. He didn't ask for a camera. He asked if my baby needed milk." She looked down at Sophia, then up again. "If that makes him unfit to lead, then maybe leadership is the wrong word for what you're doing." Silence fell so completely that even the cameras forgot themselves. For a heartbeat, the room held still like a photograph that might develop into something worth keeping. And then the vote began. Envelopes. Pens. The small theater of secrecy performed inside a fishbowl. Maria felt Elena's hand find hers. Alexander did not turn to look at her, but she knew he'd heard every word. Victor watched the ballots drop with the hunger of a man who confuses victory with oxygen. When the tally started, numbers were just numbers. Then they became a pattern. Then the pattern became a possibility. And just as the room learned which way the weight would fall, a phone vibrated on the polished table, a message lighting the screen with a headline that would make the rest of the day burn. The message on the table glowed like an ember waiting to spread fire. A headline, blunt and merciless. Gray Empire crumbles under scandal. Secret child and mistress exposed. The journalist who published it didn't care for truth, only for timing. The committee froze, some glancing down at their phones, others exchanging quick, hungry looks. Victor smiled as if the story had been written with his pen. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. The words on the screen seemed to drag her dignity through the room like something dirty. "Secret child," she whispered, holding Sophia tighter, as if the baby herself had been accused of fraud. She turned, her first instinct to leave, to flee from a place where her very presence turned into ammunition. Alexander's hand, resting lightly on the table, curled into a fist. He had tolerated whispers, tolerated rivals, tolerated the slow bleed of silence. But this, dragging Maria and Sofia into a fiction that stained their lives, cut deeper than any market loss. His voice came low and sharp, breaking through the tension like a blade. This room will decide on facts, not lies. If you prefer tabloids to ledgers, then you have already chosen to be irrelevant. Victor leaned forward, his smile widening. You think the world separates them? Truth and headlines? Perception is reality in this business. And right now, perception says you're compromised. Maria's heart hammered. She wanted to speak again to defend herself, but Elena's hand squeezed hers tightly. Not now, the gesture said. Not yet. She swallowed her fear and stayed rooted, though every bone in her body screamed to run. The vote resumed. Papers marked, envelopes collected. Numbers whispered across the table. One by one, allies and enemies revealed themselves. Maria held her breath with every tick of the tally. Alexander stood unmoving, his face carved into silence, but his eyes never left the count. When it was done, the air held still for a moment before the chair cleared his throat. By a margin of 1 vote, Mr. Gray retains his position as CEO. Victor's smile cracked, but only slightly. He leaned back, disguising his disappointment with a shrug that said the game was far from over. Maria exhaled so sharply her chest hurt. 1 vote. A single pen stroke had kept Alexander at the head of an empire. But victory tasted hollow. The headlines still spread like wildfire outside those walls, consuming whatever goodwill the speech and Maria's courage had created. By the time they stepped out, the street was a storm of voices, cameras, and questions shouted with the desperation of scavengers. Is she the mistress? Is the child his? Are you covering up a scandal? Maria's legs trembled under the weight of their words. Alexander stepped close, his body forming a shield, his voice carrying a warning edge as he ordered the car forward. They pushed through the crowd, Maria clutching Sofia, flashes exploding against her eyes until she thought she might drown in them. Back at the estate, the silence was suffocating. Mara tried to coax her into eating, Elena tried to reassure her, but Maria locked herself in the guest room. She sat on the floor, rocking Sofia, whispering through clenched teeth. You are not their story. You are mine. Only mine. Tears blurred her vision, falling hot against her daughter's tiny cheek. Alexander stood outside the door for a long time. He didn't knock. He had learned that sometimes the only mercy is space. But the sound of her muffled sobs pressed against him harder than any boardroom pressure. For the first time in years, he wanted to break his own silence. Not with strategy, not with control, but with the simple admission of how much her presence had already undone him. That night, Alexander retreated to his study, where the ledger lay open like a wound. He traced the lines of solstice with a finger, not reading numbers but remembering promises. His wife's voice haunted him, not in cruelty but in reminder. The measure of wealth is not what you keep but what you give away. He closed his eyes and saw Maria's face, pale with exhaustion but fierce with defiance, and Sofia's small fist clutching at his coat as if the fabric itself meant safety. He knew then that solstice was no longer just a project. It was a vow. To her. To them. To a world that had taught him how easily humanity could be stripped away. But enemies do not rest. Victor called a private meeting with several board members that same night. In a glass tower across town, under the glare of city lights, he laid out his plan. Gray has survived this round, he admitted, but we can erode him. Every day the press paints him as weak, as compromised, as distracted. We feed that. We cultivate doubt. Investors don't need proof, they need fear. And fear is easy to sell. The others nodded, tempted by the promise of a cleaner, quieter empire without Alexander's stubborn morality. Victor leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming. Sooner or later he will stumble. And when he does, we'll be there to claim everything. Back at the mansion, Maria finally left the guest room near dawn. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen, but there was a steadiness in her step that hadn't been there before. She found Alexander in the kitchen, still in the same clothes, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who hadn't slept. You shouldn't have brought me here, she said quietly. You've made me a target. He met her gaze, and for once his silence didn't feel distant. It felt raw. I know. Then why, she pressed, her voice trembling with exhaustion and anger. Why risk everything for me? For us? His answer came slow, each word deliberate. Because I saw myself in your fear. And I remembered what it was like to need someone to stop. Maria's breath caught. She wanted to hate him for dragging her into this storm, but instead she felt a strange, dangerous pull toward the man who had chosen, for reasons she still didn't understand, not to look away. That morning, Sophia laughed for the first time in days, a small, bubbling sound that seemed to crack the ice inside the house. Maria held her close, pressing her lips against the baby's head, and for a fleeting moment, hope bloomed where despair had rooted itself. Alexander watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes softened at the sound. Hope, however, is fragile. By afternoon, a new article hit the airwaves. This time it wasn't just rumor. Someone had leaked parts of the Solstice project, twisting it into a scandal. Headlines screamed, Gray's radical plan could bankrupt investors. Numbers ripped from context painted Alexander as reckless, endangering not just his fortune but the stability of the entire market. Maria read the words with growing dread. She recognized the handwriting in the leaked notes. It was the same she had seen in the ledger. She knew the leak had been stolen from his private desk. Someone close had betrayed him. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm gathering inside. Alexander's empire trembled, Maria's safety shrank, and the fragile connection between them strained under the weight of forces determined to break them both. And yet, even as the walls closed in, one truth burned brighter. Neither of them could turn back. The collision of their worlds had already set fire to everything. By evening, the betrayal had a face. The leaked documents bore watermarks only a handful of board members could access. Alexander stared at the copy on his desk, the ink almost glowing under the lamplight, and knew immediately whose hands had carried it out. Victor's fingerprints were everywhere, too polished to be coincidence, too cruel to be anyone else's design. But knowing wasn't the same as proving. The board would not accuse one of their own without undeniable evidence. Until then, the lie became truth. Alexander Gray, reckless billionaire, endangering his empire with radical idealism and scandalous entanglements. Investors began to retreat. Stocks dipped like birds shot mid-flight. Maria sat across from him, Sophia in her lap, her face pale in the glow. "They're saying you'll destroy everything," she whispered. "They're saying what he wants them to say," Alexander replied, his voice low but steady. "Victor feeds them fear and they drink it because it tastes like control." Maria felt the ache of helplessness flood her chest. She wanted to fight back, to scream the truth, but she knew the media's hunger. Truth wasn't enough. They needed a spectacle. They needed a story larger than the lies. "What happens if they believe him?" she asked. Alexander leaned back, the weight of his silence pressing against the walls. "Then Solstice dies. And with it, everything it could have meant." Maria pressed her lips against Sophia's head, fighting the tears. She had grown up surrounded by broken promises, governments, landlords, lovers who swore and vanished. But for the first time she believed in this one. Not just because of Alexander, but because of what Solstice represented. Light where there had only been dark. Heat where there had only been cold. Dignity where there had only been survival. "We can't let it die," she said fiercely. His eyes found hers, and something unspoken passed between them. "Then we won't." The next morning, the press found her again. They cornered her outside the estate gates, microphones like daggers, questions sharp enough to draw blood. "Are you his mistress? Is the child his heir? Are you part of his plan to take control?" Maria tried to push past, but the crowd swelled. One reporter shoved a photo in her face, an image of her cradling Sophia inside the mansion, taken through a long lens. The headline scrawled beneath it, "The Secret Family of Alexander Gray." Her knees nearly buckled. Heat rushed to her face. "That's a lie," she said, her voice trembling. "We're not." But the words died as the shouts drowned her out. She clutched Sophia close, shielding her from the storm. Somewhere in the chaos, someone sneered, "Gold digger," and the word struck harder than any shove. A car door opened behind her. Alexander stepped out, his tall frame cutting through the sea of bodies. His hand pressed gently to her back, guiding her forward. For a heartbeat, the world hushed. The sight of him, silent, controlled, protective, was its own headline. Inside the car, Maria's hands shook. "They'll never stop," she whispered. "They stop when you stop feeding them," Alexander said. "But they're not feeding on me anymore," she said bitterly. "They're feeding on us." His silence was an answer she didn't want but understood. That evening, Elena arrived with fire in her eyes and a phone in her hand. "They're not just after your company," she told Alexander. "They're after her. They're painting her as a fraud, a manipulator. They're digging into her past. If they find anything they can twist, anything, it'll burn her alive. Maria felt her stomach clench. Her past was nothing but ordinary struggle, but even struggle could be twisted into scandal. Missed rent payments became irresponsibility. A job lost became laziness. Tears shed became manipulation. Alexander's jaw tightened. "No one touches her," he said, the words sharp as glass. Elena met his gaze, unflinching. "Then you have to speak. You can't protect her with silence. You can't protect Solstice with silence either." Alexander turned away, pacing the length of the room. Silence had been his armor for so long that removing it felt like stepping naked into fire. But he could see now that silence wasn't protecting them. It was protecting Victor. Maria's voice came soft but steady. "If you don't speak, I will. I'll stand in front of their cameras and I'll tell them the truth. They'll twist it, yes, but maybe someone will hear." Alexander stopped. His eyes locked onto hers, a storm behind them. "You don't belong in this fight." She rose, holding Sophia against her chest. "Then where do I belong? Hiding in your house while the world decides who I am? While they decide who she is?" She looked down at her baby, her arms tightening. "No. I won't let them write her story before she can even speak." The word struck him harder than any rival ever had. For the first time in years, Alexander felt fear, not for markets or power, but for the fragile bond forming in the space between them. Later that night, he found himself in the study again, staring at the ledger. But this time, he didn't just trace the lines. He opened a drawer, pulled out a small box, and set it on the desk. Inside lay a fountain pen, untouched since the day his wife had died. He picked it up, the weight strange in his hand, and began to write. Not numbers, not charts. Words. Words meant to be spoken. Maria passed the doorway and froze when she saw him. For a long moment, she simply watched, the silent man writing his voice back into existence. Finally, he looked up. His expression carried no hesitation. "Tomorrow," he said. "I speak tomorrow." Maria's breath caught. Relief, fear, and something dangerously close to admiration tangled inside her. She nodded, holding Sophia closer, as if bracing herself for the storm to come. Meanwhile, across the city, Victor tightened his grip. He met with journalists, leaked more half-truths, and spread rumors that Alexander was preparing to resign. He fed the narrative of collapse, painting himself as the savior waiting in the wings. But storms have a way of changing direction. The next morning, Alexander walked into the boardroom not with silence, but with resolve. Maria was there, seated at the back with Sophia, Elena at her side. Cameras lined the walls, reporters scribbling furiously. For the first time in years, the world waited not for his silence, but for his words. He stepped to the podium. The room hushed. He set down the pen, unfolded the paper he had written the night before, and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. His eyes flicked to Maria, and for a heartbeat, the weight of her trust steadied him. Then he spoke. The first words were almost a whisper, but in the silence of the boardroom they carried like thunder. "For years I believed silence was strength. That if I stayed quiet, no one could twist my words, no one could turn them into weapons. But silence can be as dangerous as a lie. And today, I refuse to let silence define me anymore." The room leaned forward. Journalists froze mid-scribble. Victor's jaw tightened, the smile slipping. Alexander didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the room as if he could see past the walls, past the cameras, past the city itself. "I stopped that night because I saw a child. A mother. Cold, ignored, invisible. I stopped because I could not keep driving and pretend the world outside my window was someone else's problem. If that is weakness, then I will be weak every day of my life. If that is scandal, then let the scandal stand taller than any tower in this city." Maria's throat tightened as she clutched Sophia, her eyes stinging. The words weren't polished like Victor's speeches. They weren't sharpened by consultants. They were raw, stripped, human. And that made them dangerous. Alexander held up the ledger, pages heavy with numbers. "This is Solstice. They will tell you it's reckless. They will tell you it threatens our empire. They will tell you it cannot work. But what they won't tell you is who it will help. Families who choose between food and light, children who study by candle flame, neighborhoods written off as unprofitable. This project is not about charity. It is about responsibility. If I lose everything making it happen, then let me lose it. But I will not let greed bury the future." The board erupted into murmurs, half outrage, half awe. The journalists scribbled furiously, some shaking their heads, others wide-eyed as if they just heard something they hadn't expected from a man with billions. Victor stood, his voice slick with venom. This is emotional manipulation. Look at him, parading a woman and child as props, selling dreams like their strategy. You think investors want bedtime stories? They want numbers, and the numbers prove he is driving us into collapse. Alexander didn't flinch. The numbers are here, he said calmly, tapping the ledger. But the question is, do you have the courage to read them? The cameras caught everything. The clash of philosophies, the man of silence speaking with conviction, the rival unraveling under the weight of his own rage. For the first time, the narrative began to shift. Not entirely, not cleanly, but enough. Enough to plant doubt in Victor's story. Enough to make people wonder if Alexander's silence had not been apathy, but grief. And if grief could become resolve. When the session ended, Maria barely had time to breathe before microphones were shoved toward her again. Is he telling the truth? Are you part of this project? What do you gain from this? Her hands shook, but she remembered Elena's advice. Real words. Short sentences. She lifted Sophia slightly so the cameras couldn't ignore her. We didn't ask for this. He saw us. That's all. And if the world thinks seeing someone is weakness, then maybe the world needs to rethink its strength. The clip spread within hours. On social media, comments split like lightning across a dark sky. Some called her a saint, a symbol of resilience. Others branded her a fraud, a manipulator, a plant in Alexander's grand performance. The hate was sharp, but the hope was louder than before. Inside the mansion, the mood was fragile. Mara served dinner, but no one ate much. Elena scrolled through reactions on her phone, muttering about algorithms and bias, but Maria barely listened. She sat across from Alexander, watching him with a mixture of fear and something that might have been pride. You changed everything today, she said softly. No, he replied. I just said what I should have said years ago. But it cost you, she pressed. He leaned back, eyes tired but alive. Everything worth keeping costs something. That night, protesters gathered outside Grey Tower. Some carried signs demanding his resignation. Others carried candles, chanting for Solstice to be saved. The city had split itself down the middle, and both sides burned with passion. Victor seized the chaos. He appeared on late-night news, his voice calm, his suit immaculate. This is dangerous sentimentality dressed up as leadership, he told the anchors. Alexander Grey is no longer fit to protect investors or employees. He is driven by personal scandal, not strategic vision. His words were smooth, crafted to sound like reason, but his eyes betrayed his hunger. Still, not everyone was convinced. A clip of Alexander feeding Sophia during a break leaked online. He hadn't known anyone was recording. The sight of a billionaire cradling a baby with steady hands, no cameras, no audience, no performance. Just a man doing what needed to be done, spread faster than Victor's rehearsed attacks. Millions watched, argued, shared. Some sneered. Many softened. Maria lay awake in the guest room, scrolling through the endless stream of opinions. Her chest tightened as she read cruel words, but then her breath caught when she saw a comment beneath the video of Alexander with Sophia. If this is weakness, I want leaders this week. She closed her eyes, clutching her daughter close. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to listen. But Victor was far from finished. The following day, financial networks blared with predictions of collapse. Stocks dipped lower, fueled by fear campaigns. Anonymous sources whispered about secret bank accounts, hidden debts, betrayal within the company itself. Maria could see the exhaustion dragging Alexander down, but he refused to bend. We push forward with Solstice, he told the few allies left in his inner circle. Not because it's safe, because it's necessary. And if they destroy you? Elena asked. His eyes flicked to Maria, then to Sophia. Then let them. But they will not destroy this. That night, as Maria stood in the garden with Sophia asleep against her shoulder, Alexander joined her. The air was sharp, winter holding on even as spring threatened. She looked at him, at the man who had been a ghost in his own empire, now burning brighter than the lights in his towers. You can't go back now, she said. No, he agreed. And I wouldn't even if I could. Something in his tone made her chest ache with a fear she couldn't name. Because what he meant wasn't just about the company. It was about her. About them. About a collision neither of them had expected but neither could undo. And somewhere, in a high-rise across the city, Victor plotted his final strike. The days after Alexander's speech felt like living inside a storm. Every hour brought new headlines, new speculation, new waves of hatred and admiration tangled together. Some called him brave, others reckless. Some called Maria an angel, others a parasite. It was as if the entire city had divided itself into mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of the truth. Maria could have hidden. She wanted to, some nights. She wanted to lock the door, curl around Sofia, and wait for the noise to fade. But she knew by now that the noise would not fade, it would only grow louder until she faced it. Elena pushed her gently. You have a voice, Maria. You think it's small because the world told you it was. But you've been surviving in silence your whole life. That means your voice is stronger than you realize. Use it. The first time she agreed to speak publicly, it was for a small community center in one of the neighborhoods Solstice was designed to reach. She stood at the front of a room with peeling paint and plastic chairs, her knees trembling, Sofia's tiny hand curled around her finger. The faces watching her weren't powerful. They weren't wealthy. But they were the people the city forgot. She swallowed hard, then spoke. I never thought I'd be standing here. I was just surviving, trying to keep my baby warm. And then one man stopped. Not because he needed anything from me. Not because it made him look good. He just stopped. That's why I'm here. Because if someone with everything can stop for someone with nothing, then maybe there's hope for the rest of us too. When she finished, the room erupted, not with applause meant for headlines, but with applause that carried gratitude, recognition. Some cried, some nodded silently, and Maria realized in that moment that her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to every mother who had counted coins at a pharmacy counter, every father who had skipped meals so their children could eat, every child who had wondered why the world forgot them. News of her speech spread quietly at first, then faster. Clips appeared online. Strangers called her authentic, unpolished, real. For every insult thrown her way, 100 voices rose to defend her. Maria's hands still shook when she spoke, but her voice grew steadier. Alexander watched all of it with something like awe. He had expected to shield her, to keep her safe behind walls and silence. Instead, she had stepped forward, not as his shadow, but as his equal. She was doing what he had failed to do for years, turning pain into power. One evening, after another long day of interviews and planning sessions, Alexander found Maria in the garden. Sofia was asleep in a stroller beside them, the air cool with the promise of spring. Maria looked tired, her hair loose, her eyes shadowed. Yet she glowed with a determination that no exhaustion could dim. You're stronger than I ever was, he said quietly. She turned, surprised. You're the one facing Victor, the board, the whole empire. I'm just... No, he cut in. Don't say just. You speak with nothing but your truth and people listen. I had billions and stayed silent. You had nothing and turned silence into a weapon. That's not weakness. That's strength I could never learn. Her chest tightened at his words. For weeks, she had seen him as untouchable, unreachable, a man carved out of stone. Now she saw the cracks, the grief that shaped him, the doubt that haunted him. And in those cracks, she saw not weakness, but humanity. You don't have to do this alone, she said softly. For the first time, he didn't argue. He simply nodded. That night, Maria sat at a desk in the guest room, Sofia sleeping peacefully beside her. She wrote in a notebook, thoughts, memories, ideas. Not polished speeches, not strategic plans, just words that mattered to her. She didn't realize until much later that Alexander had passed by the open door and paused, watching her write with the same reverence he once reserved for his ledger. The next day, she joined him in a meeting with allies of Solstice. At first, the men around the table looked at her with skepticism. What could a poor woman know about billion-dollar projects? But when Alexander asked her to speak, she didn't hesitate. She talked about counting coins at grocery stores, about neighbors huddled around one space heater, about candles used not for romance but for survival. The room shifted. Her words carried the weight of experience no data sheet could replicate. When the meeting ended, one investor whispered to another, "She's the future of this project." Alexander heard it, and for once he didn't feel threatened. He felt relief. Because Solstice was no longer his alone, it was theirs. But growth never comes without resistance. Victor intensified his attacks. He began targeting Maria directly, planting stories that painted her as manipulative, as using her child to climb into wealth. The cruelty was vicious, personal. Maria nearly broke the night she saw her face splashed across a tabloid with the headline, "Gray's Mistress or Mastermind?" She shut herself in the bathroom, shaking, her reflection blurred by tears. "I can't do this," she whispered. Alexander knocked once, then entered quietly. He didn't try to deny her pain, didn't tell her to be stronger. He simply knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "They don't know you," he said softly. "But I do. And I will not let them take your voice from you." She leaned into him, her body trembling, and for the first time since the storm began, she let herself rest in his arms. The next morning she stood in front of cameras again. Not because she wanted to, but because she refused to let Victor win. Her voice cracked, her hands shook, but she said the words anyway. I am not here for money. I'm not here for power. I am here because no one else stopped. And if they hate me for that, then let them. I'd rather be hated for telling the truth than loved for living a lie. The clip went viral within hours. Even people who despised Alexander found themselves moved. Because Maria wasn't a billionaire, wasn't a politician. She was just a mother, speaking from a place everyone recognized: survival. Slowly the tide began to turn. Protests in favor of Solstice grew larger. Communities that had been ignored for decades began to speak louder, demanding change. Maria's words lit a fire Alexander's billions never could. One night, as they walked the halls of the mansion, Sophia asleep in Maria's arms, Alexander spoke softly. When this began, I thought I was saving you. But now I see it clearly, you've been saving me. Maria's throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, to insist she was nothing but a woman caught in the current. But the truth shone too brightly to ignore. She had changed him. And he had changed her. The storm still raged outside, Victor still plotted, the board still hesitated. But for the first time, Maria and Alexander weren't just surviving. They were building. Together. And as spring finally began to break through winter's grip, they both knew the real battle was yet to come. The weeks that followed were like standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground beneath their feet erode grain by grain. For every speech Maria gave, for every step forward the Solstice Project took, Victor struck harder. It began with whispers of corruption, then escalated into fabricated documents leaked to the press. The story was that Alexander had siphoned millions from pension funds to finance Solstice. A lie, but a convincing one. Reporters swarmed the gates of the mansion, cameras flashing like lightning storms. Alexander held his silence, as he always had. But this time, Maria saw the weight bending his shoulders, the fatigue dulling his eyes. He could fight battles of finance, of markets, of numbers, but this was a war of perception, and perception did not play fair. One night, as rain lashed against the mansion windows, Maria found him sitting alone in his study, the ledger open on the desk before him. But for the first time his pen lay untouched. His hands were still, his eyes distant. They're winning, he said finally, his voice low, ragged. She stepped closer. No, they're louder. That's not the same as winning. His lips pressed into a line, his jaw tight. The board is preparing a vote of no confidence. Victor's campaign is working. If they push me out, Solstice dies. Her heart clenched. She thought of the families who had come to her after speeches, telling her how Solstice could save their neighborhoods. She thought of Sophia's small hand curling around hers, the dream of a world where her daughter wouldn't have to survive as she had. Then we don't let them push you out, she whispered. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw not the billionaire but the man, tired, grieving, human. What if I can't stop them? She placed her hand over his. Then I will. The words startled even her, but once spoken, they burned with truth. The next morning, Maria began preparing for a different kind of battle. Elena connected her with journalists willing to listen. She rehearsed speeches, practiced questions, steeled herself for attacks. Each night, she returned to Sophia's room, kissing her daughter's forehead, reminding herself why she fought. The board meeting approached like a storm on the horizon. Rumors swirled. Victor had secured enough votes, Alexander would be ousted, Solstice dismantled. The mansion became a fortress of tension. Staff whispered in corners. Phones rang without pause. Maria kept walking forward, though every step felt like carrying a mountain. On the eve of the vote, Victor made his boldest move yet. At a lavish gala crowded with reporters, he stood beneath chandeliers and declared that Solstice was a fraud, a scam designed to funnel billions into Alexander's pocket. He held up papers, fabricated evidence, but the cameras caught every word, every accusation. Maria watched the broadcast from the mansion, fury and fear twisting inside her. She turned to Alexander. You can't stay silent this time. He shook his head. If I speak, they'll say I'm defending myself. They'll call it desperation. But if you... He stopped, the words catching. She understood. If she spoke, it wouldn't be the billionaire defending his empire. It would be the woman who had nothing, standing against the man who had everything. Maria didn't sleep that night. She wrote and rewrote her speech, her hands trembling, her chest tight. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't trained for this. But she had lived it. And she knew the truth. Dawn arrived gray and heavy. The board meeting would begin in hours. Maria dressed simply, a plain blouse, a jacket borrowed from Elena. She clutched the worn ledger Alexander had once donated to the library, its pages filled with the scribbled notes that had first connected them. When she walked into the boardroom, silence fell. Men in suits turned to stare. Some sneered, others looked curious, but none expected her. Victor smirked from his seat. "What is this? The charity case brought in for sympathy?" Maria's pulse raced, but her voice held steady. "No. I'm here because the truth has been twisted long enough, and someone has to untangle it." She placed the ledger on the table. "This," she tapped the cover, "is where it began. Alexander donated this book to my library years ago. Inside I found his notes. Ideas, dreams, plans for Solstice. Long before Victor's lies, long before your doubt. This wasn't about money. It was about people. Families. Children who freeze in the dark because power companies charge more than they can pay. I know because I was one of those families." A murmur rippled through the room. Victor leaned forward, eyes cold. "You expect us to believe that and nobody like you understands billion-dollar infrastructure?" Maria met his gaze without flinching. "I understand hunger. I understand cold. I understand what it means to be invisible. And I understand that if you kill Solstice, you're not punishing Alexander, you're punishing every family that prayed for light in the dark." The room stilled. For the first time, Maria saw hesitation flicker across some of the board members' faces. She pressed on. "You can choose Victor's lies or you can choose the truth. And the truth is this: Alexander Gray has already given everything to this project. And so have I. If you destroy it, you destroy more than numbers on a page. You destroy hope." Silence stretched. Then one board member cleared his throat. I believe her." Another nodded. Then another. Victor's face darkened, but Maria didn't look at him. She looked at Alexander, whose eyes glistened with something she had never seen before: pride. The vote was postponed. Solstice survived, barely. But Maria knew this was not the end. Victor would not stop. He would strike harder, fiercer, more desperate. That night, as the city buzzed with rumors of the dramatic boardroom clash, Maria sat on the steps of the mansion, the ledger in her lap. Alexander joined her, silent for a long moment before speaking. "You didn't just save Solstice," he said softly. "You saved me." She shook her head, a faint smile curving her lips. "No. We saved each other." The sky above them stretched wide, heavy with stars, as if the universe itself held its breath. They both knew the final storm was coming. Victor was wounded, and wounded men were dangerous. But for the first time Maria felt ready, because she wasn't alone anymore. The final blow came faster than anyone expected. Only days after the board postponed its vote, the headlines exploded. Victor had leaked what looked like ironclad evidence. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, signed documents, proof, at least on the surface, that Alexander had indeed stolen billions through Solstice. Reporters camped outside the mansion gates, their shouts echoing across the estate walls. News anchors spoke in grim tones, their voices carrying into every home: the fall of Alexander Gray. Inside, chaos reigned. Calls poured in from investors, allies, even lifelong friends. Some demanded answers. Others cut ties without hesitation. The mansion, once a fortress of silence, now felt like a cage tightening by the hour. Maria held Sophia close as the child asked questions she couldn't answer. Why are there people shouting outside? Why are they angry at Mr. Alexander? She stroked her daughter's hair, heartbreaking. Because sometimes people don't understand the truth. But we do. And that's what matters. But in the quiet of night, when Sophia finally slept, Maria's courage faltered. She found Alexander in his study, surrounded by scattered files, his tie loosened, his face drawn with exhaustion. "They've destroyed me," he said flatly, not looking up. "Even if the truth comes out later, the damage is done. Solstice is finished. I'm finished." "No," Maria said firmly, though her own voice trembled. "They want you to believe that. That's how Victor wins, by making you give up before the fight is over." He lifted his eyes to hers, and she saw despair there deeper than any wound. "Maria, I've spent my whole life building walls. And you broke through them. But now I wonder, did I only drag you into my ruin?" She crossed the room, placing her hand over his. "No. You gave me a chance to fight. And I won't stop now." The next morning Maria made a choice. She would go public, not in boardrooms or polished halls, but in the streets where she had once lived, where her voice would matter most. Elena helped arrange it. A small rally in the heart of the city, in the square where families gathered and vendors sold food. Dozens turned out, then hundreds, then more, drawn not by power or wealth but by the raw urgency of her voice. She stood before them, holding the worn ledger like a shield. They want you to believe Solstice is a scam. They want you to believe Alexander Gray is just another billionaire who takes and takes. But I know better. I know because I found his vision long before I met him. And because I lived the life Solstice was meant to change. The crowd leaned in, silent, listening. I know what it is to go hungry. I know what it is to put a child to bed cold. And I know what it is to be invisible until someone finally looked and said, "You matter." Solstice is not about him. It's about us. And if we let them kill it, we are saying that our lives are worth nothing. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling like a wave. Cameras captured every moment. Her words spread across social media, reaching millions in hours. The narrative began to shift, not entirely but enough to spark doubt about Victor's claims. Victor responded with fury. He held a press conference, waving more evidence, sneering at Maria as a manipulative opportunist. A librarian turned liar, he spat into the cameras. Do you really trust a woman who showed up out of nowhere, clutching a child, whispering in a billionaire's ear? Maria watched from the mansion, her stomach twisting. Alexander stood beside her, jaw tight. He's trying to turn your past against you, he said. She nodded. Then we use it. We tell the truth. All of it. And so they did. That night, Alexander broke his silence. For the first time in years, he appeared on live television. Not to defend his wealth, not to argue numbers, but to stand beside Maria. He began softly, his voice carrying weight. I built an empire of glass towers and contracts. But in all those years, I forgot what my wife once told me, that a life is measured not by what you build, but by what you give. Maria reminded me of that. She reminded me that silence isn't strength, it's surrender. And I will not surrender. Not to lies, not to greed, not to fear. Maria spoke then, her hand trembling but her voice steady. Yes, I was poor. Yes, I was invisible. But I am not ashamed. Because my story is the story of millions who deserve warmth, dignity, and light. If that disqualifies me from standing beside him, then so be it. But I will not step back. And neither should you. The broadcast shook the city. Within hours, hashtags trended, petitions formed, and rallies erupted. Ordinary people, families, workers, students, took to the streets chanting, "Save Solstice." Victor's empire began to crumble. Investigators dug into his evidence and found cracks, signatures forged, documents doctored. The tide turned. But the battle wasn't over. At the decisive board meeting, Victor arrived with lawyers, still defiant. The room crackled with tension. Alexander and Maria entered together, hand in hand, a silent statement that no amount of lies could break their bond. The chairman opened the floor. Victor launched into accusations, his voice sharp, venomous. Then Maria rose. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She simply opened the ledger and read aloud the words Alexander had scribbled years ago. No child should freeze in the dark. No family should be invisible. Wealth is nothing if it cannot bring light. Silence followed. The kind that weighs heavier than any argument. One by one, board members cast their votes. When the tally was revealed, Victor paled. He had lost. Alexander remained CEO. Solstice lived. But more than that, Maria's voice had shifted the ground itself. She was no longer invisible. She was undeniable. Victor stormed out, his empire collapsing behind him. But Maria didn't watch him go. She turned to Alexander, who looked at her with awe, gratitude, and something deeper, something that promised a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The room erupted with relief, applause, questions. But for Maria and Alexander, all the noise faded. In that moment, the only truth was that they had faced ruin, fear, and lies, and they had won. The storm had passed, though the echoes of it still lingered in the air. The mansion, once a fortress weighed down by silence and scandal, now pulsed with a different kind of energy, relief, renewal, even hope. News outlets that had once called for Alexander's downfall now marveled at the story of his survival. They spoke of this silent billionaire, who had found his voice, and the librarian who had stood at his side. But for Alexander and Maria, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that Solstice was alive, and so were they. On the balcony overlooking the gardens, Maria stood with Sophia, the little girl pressing her cheek against her mother's arm. Sophia's laughter carried through the air, brighter than it had been in years, and Maria felt a weight lift that she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Behind her, Alexander stepped quietly into the light. He no longer wore the armor of polished suits or the mask of stoic silence. He looked simply like a man, tired, yes, but lighter, freer. "She's happy," he said softly, watching Sophia chase a butterfly across the grass. Maria turned, smiling faintly. "She's finally safe." Alexander's gaze lingered on her, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, admiration, the quiet acknowledgement of battles fought side by side. He reached into his pocket and drew out the ledger, the same book that had bound their paths together. Its cover was worn, its pages smudged, but it had carried them to this moment. He held it out. "This belongs to you now." Maria shook her head gently. "No, it always belonged to you. I just reminded you what it meant." For the first time in years, Alexander laughed. A small, unguarded sound, but it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Then maybe we reminded each other." The city around them began to heal as Solstice prepared its first launch. Crews assembled solar grids in forgotten neighborhoods. Lights flickered on where darkness had reigned. And in each spark, Maria saw proof that their struggle had not been in vain. She watched Sophia smile as the child pointed at the glowing rooftops in the distance. "Look, Mama," she whispered. "It's like the stars came down." Maria's throat tightened. She turned to Alexander, whose eyes reflected the same light. They didn't need to say anything. The truth was already written in the night. They had saved more than an empire. They had saved each other. And though battles would come again, they now knew one thing with absolute certainty. Together, they could endure anything. Months later, the first solstice grids lit up entire neighborhoods. Families stepped onto balconies just to watch the glow spread street by street. Maria stood beside Alexander and Sophia, the three of them wrapped in the hum of something greater than wealth, belonging. The man once called the silent billionaire no longer walked alone, and the librarian who once lived in shadows now carried light. Their story had begun in cold and despair, but it had ended with warmth powerful enough to touch the world. And now, I want to hear from you. If you were Maria, facing a world that doubted you, would you have stood before the board and risked everything? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. If this story moved you, hit the like button so more people can see it, and don't forget to subscribe because the next story might just be the one that stays with you forever. Together, we'll keep uncovering tales that prove even the smallest spark can change everything.